Good afternoon, dear colleagues and guests. Today is June 21st, 2021, 3 o'clock Moscow time. Before we begin, I would like all the members of the Dissertation Council to turn on your cameras and not turn off the microphones yet. Let the meeting of the Dissertation Council on the defense of the thesis of Rysev Nikolay Yuryevichев for the degree of candidate of psychology on scientific speciality 190003, work psychology, engineering psychology, economics, on topic psychological features of the strategy of the influence in behavior in common negotiations, considered open. Order of the Academic Secretary of St. Petersburg State University, Knyazov Alexander Valentinovich, from the 8th of April 2021, number 2871/1. I, Grieva Svetlana, Doctor of Sciences of Psychology, Professor, Head of the Department of Social Psychology, am appointed the Chairman of the Dissertation Council. The same order approved the members of the Dissertation Council. Let me introduce themselves. In the remote access mode, the following members of the Dissertation Council attend: Fortepianova Natalia Evgenievna, Doctor of Psychology, Professor of the Department of Psychological Support of Professional Activity, St. Petersburg State University. Natalia Evgenievna, can you hear us? Kostromina Svetlana Nikolaevna, Doctor of Psychology, Professor, Head of the Department of Personality Psychology, St. Petersburg State University. Can you hear and see us? Yes, everything is fine. Voznov Alexander Alexandrovich, Doctor of Psychology, Professor, Chief Scientific Officer of Laboratory of Occupational Psychology, Ergonomics, Engineering Psychology, Institute of Psychology of the Russian Academy of Sciences. Can you see and hear us? Yes, can see and hear you perfectly well. Also, in the remote access mode, we have Alexios Aravanitis, PhD, University of Crete, Greece. Can you see and hear us?
I can see and hear you very well, thank you.
Also, the candidate, Rysev Nikolay Yuryevichев, is present here. The scientific advisor of the candidate is Manachev Sergei, candidate of psychology, associate professor, head of the Department of Ergonomics and Engineering Psychology of St. Petersburg State University. Now, in order to improve the quality of communication, I ask you, dear colleague, who are in remote access mode, turn off your microphones. But please do not forget to turn them on when you're given the floor. Thank you. I would also like to inform you that we perform audio-video recording of our today's meeting, and there is live broadcast on the St. Petersburg State University website. Simultaneous interpretation is being carried out. On the screen, the live broadcast of the meeting, you can see the available email address during the meeting where all those willing might send their questions to, if they concern directly the content of the thesis and the presentation. Thus, anyone can take part in scientific discussion. These questions will be sent to me by the technical services, and I will voice them during the discussion. Questions should be directly related to the presentation of the applicant and the content of the thesis. It is obligatory to indicate the name, position, and place of work of the author of the question. Questions that are not related to the scientific discussion and the thesis, the text, the assessment of the thesis itself, as well as anonymous questions, will not be voiced. In accordance with the procedure of awarding the academic degrees of Candidate of Sciences, academic degrees of Doctor of Sciences in Specility University, approved by local regulations of Specility University, hereinafter the procedure. A meeting of the Dissertation Council considered competent if at least 2/3 of the approved composition take part in its work, but in no less than 4 people. Our dissertation board consists of 5 people. All 5 are present, including 4 members of the Dissertation Council in remote access mode. And audiovisual contact is provided. Thus, there is a quorum. I ask the employee of the Department for the Support of the Activities of Dissertation Council, Curator of the Defense, to issue a turnout list. I established the following rules of procedure for today's meeting, with a total duration of approximately 2 hours. First, brief information of the chairman about the applicant and the documents submitted by the applicant for scientific degree and their compliance with the established requirements. Answers to possible questions, about 5 minutes. 2. A short presentation by the applicant, reflecting the main provisions of the research, 15 minutes. 3. Questions to the applicant strictly to his report, no more than 2 minutes per question. 4. Responses of the applicant, no more than 5 minutes. 5. Speeches of all members of the Dissertation Council with the assessment of the dissertation thesis, as well as with questions and suggestions for the candidate. About 10 minutes per speaker. Speech by the chairman with the assessment of the dissertation thesis. 7. Answers of the applicant to the questions and comments. Open discussion. Those present at the defense of the dissertation might summarize their position and provide questions and proposals to the thesis strictly on the topic of the research, no more than 2 minutes per everyone. In this case, we ask everyone to sign in the registration sheet and introduce themselves before they give their questions. The presentation of the chairman of the questions received via online broadcast will be voiced. Written questions which require more than 2 minutes to be voiced will not be read. The applicant's answer, no more than 2 minutes per question. Presentation by the scientific advisor, no more than 3 minutes. Discussion by the members of the Dissertation Council before the open vote, during which the sound of the broadcast is muted, about 5 minutes. Then we proceed with the open roll call, counting of votes, followed by recording the results in the minutes of the meeting. Next, making decision whether or not to award an academic degree. Finally, concluding remarks of the applicant, no more than 2 minutes. Dear colleagues, are there any questions or objections to these regulations? If there are no objections, I will proceed to the implementation of the rules of procedure. First of all, I ask you to mute your mobile phones. Thank you for your understanding. Dear colleagues who are in the remote access mode, please do not turn off your mobile phones in case we need to contact you. So we're starting the meeting. The chairman's brief report. The thesis by Rysev, Nikolay, Yuryevichef, with the scientific degree of Candidate of Psychology on the scientific major 1900-03, Word Psychology, Engineering, Psychology, Economics, on topic 5 psychological features of the strategies of the influence in behaviour in commercial negotiations, was approved for defence on the 3rd of March 2021. Rysev Nikolay Yuryevichef wrote this thesis at St. Petersburg State University. The scientific advisor is PhD, Associate Professor, Head of the Department of Economics and Engineering Psychology of St. Petersburg State University, Manichev Sergei Alexeyevich. The number of publications of the applicant, which set out the basic scientific result of the thesis, according to the list, amount to 8 works. In peer-reviewed journals from a list approved by the Ministry of Education of the Russian Federation, 3 publications. In publication indexed in the soundometric databases Web of Science and Scopus, there are no valuable publications. The applicant submitted to the Academic Secretary of St. Petersburg State University a complete package of documents for acceptance, for consideration and defense of the thesis. All the documents correspond to Clause 12 of Section 3 of the procedure. All the documents submitted, according to the information I have received from the curator, meet the requirements and are stored in the applicant's certification file. Their copies are also possessed by the officer of the Department for Support of the Decision Council, who is present at the meeting. Before giving the floor to the applicant, I have a question to the members of the Decision Council. To members of the Decision Council, do you have any questions to the applicant, including whether there is a need to announce the entire list of documents submitted by the applicant for defense? No questions.
No questions at this point. Thank you.
Then we'll move on to the next point. That is the brief presentation by the applicant, Nikolay Yuryevichef. The floor is yours. You have 15 minutes. Thank you very much. Well, the object of study. Dear Chairman of the Decision Council, dear members of the Decision Council, Svetlana Nikolaevna, Natalia Evgeniyevna, Alexander Alexandrovich, Alexei Sovranitis. The object of the study. The object of the research is the process of commercial negotiations. In our case, we are modeling commercial negotiations in the context of business game strategies and tactics of negotiations created by the author of the work. The main subject of the research is 5 strategies of influencing behavior: ignorance, dominance, manipulation, compromise, and cooperation. Additional research subject is 4 situations of negotiation: symmetrical business negotiations, symmetrical personal negotiations, asymmetrical business negotiation with dependent weak position, asymmetrical business negotiation with an independent strong position. Also, an additional subject of research is 27 technical methods of influence. We conducted a study during which 944 pair negotiations took place for 10 minutes. The experiment involved 475 subjects. 240 subjects are male, 235 are female. The age of the subjects was from 18 to 58 years old. The average age is 38. 85% of the subjects have higher education, 15% have secondary or incomplete higher education. They are the representatives of commercial organizations in Petersburg State, Moscow and Minsk. The basic positions are company's owner, entrepreneur, general manager, commercial director, marketeer, sales manager, purchasing manager, trading second representative, manager to work with clients. 237 subjects were included in Group A and 338 into Group B. The independent variables in the psychological study are the following: list and description of 5 negotiation strategies, list and description of 4 types of situations, list of 87 technical methods of influence, personal characteristics of the subjects, the result of the textbook 5, emotional intelligence and max scale. The dependent variables in this quasi-experiment are as follows: the choice of the subject of Group A of 4 out of 5 strategies for 4 different types of situation. We, for 5 out of 27 technical methods of influence, did the subject of Group A choose for each of the 5 strategies, and what for 5 out of 27 technical methods of influence did the subject of Group B choose when guessing which tactical methods were used by the opponent. The reliability of the research result is determined by the adequately used method of statistical analysis of the data obtained, comparison of the frequency of using strategies using the Barnum criterion, descriptive statistics, rank correlation, measurement of p-level of significance, exploratory factor analysis with a measurement of the measure of the adequacy of KMO example, the criterion for independent samples using the Lewin quality criterion, non-parametric Mann-Whitney test for independent samples, reliability analysis according to Alpha Kronbach. 3 provisions for defense are as following. First position, the frequency of using negotiation strategies is related to the measure of taking into account the interest of another person. Out of the 5 strategies studies, namely ignorance, domination, manipulation, compromise, and cooperation, 3 types of strategy can be stressed. Win-win strategy, win-win strategy, and no win-win strategy for both sides. The first type is a 2-win strategy that takes into account the interests of both parties, that is, cooperation and compromise. The second type is one-sided winning strategy, and with one's own interest or dominance is taken into account. And the manipulation strategy can also be interpreted as one-way winning strategy, but with 2 significant limitations. Manipulation is not applied in a directive manner. And secondly, the object of manipulation still receives some additional emotional gain, but does not achieve the main result in negotiations. And the last strategy with no payoff for both sides, lose-lose, that is, and ignore, in which no one's interest is taken into account. The prevailing strategies change a different situation. In symmetrical business negotiations with long-term implication, people are most likely to consciously choose either dominance or cooperation strategy. In symmetrical personal negotiations with short-term consequences, people are more likely to consciously choose the strategy of compromise and cooperation. In asymmetrical business negotiation with medium-term consequences, where people occupy a weaker and more dependent position, they are more likely to deliberately prefer a strategy of cooperation and compromise. And in the last situation, in symmetrical business negotiation, where people are in stronger and more independent position, they're more likely to choose the strategy of ignoring and domineering. In the first 3 situations, the negotiator regards the strategy as a super task. But if the negotiator does not feel the strength to apply the strategy of bilateral cooperation in the first situation, he resorts to domination. In the second or third situation, if there is no opportunity for applying the strategy of cooperation, he resorts to compromise. Negotiator also wins, but not as much as in cooperation. In a compromise, there is a desire to minimize damage. In the fourth situation, the negotiator uses either a position of strength or a zero-win strategy of ignoring. And only the manipulation strategy stands apart, since it is applied relatively evenly in all 4 situations. The second position for defense deals with the strategy of manipulation. In our opinion, this strategy reduces the emotional effect in comparison with the strategies of ignoring and domineering, and saves the time of connotation in comparison with the strategies of compromise and cooperation. The use of the manipulation strategy does not hurt the partner and saves the relationship, provided the manipulation is not realized by the opponent later, in comparison with the strategies of dominance and ignoring. The use of the strategy of manipulation versus strategies of compromise and cooperation implicitly translates a symmetrical relationship into an asymmetric one of the manipulator, but reduces the opponent's emotional negative reaction in comparison with strategies of domineering and ignoring. It's important to emphasize that the choice of manipulation strategy is less dependent on the specific of the situation. Men, more often than women, plan to use the manipulation strategy. And the third provision for defense. The operational composition of one-side win strategy is relatively stable. Manipulation strategy consists of the following key components. Disguise of the fact of impact. Disguise of the true purpose. 3. Attitude to the opponent as the means of achieving a goal. 4. Manipulator affects the self-esteem of another person. 5. During manipulation, there is a decrease in the use of persuasion method. A dominant strategy consists of the following key components: pressure, coercion, the use of the words must, reduce of the highlighting potential gains and benefit methods, and reduce of the use of the clear articulation of common goals methods. 8 hypotheses were specified in the thesis. They are related to the main ideas of defense. In the first, the subjects use domineering cooperation much more often. If we talk about symmetrical and business-like situation, domineering strategy was chosen by 31.1%. Of respondents, cooperation was chosen by 29%. Checking the distribution for 5 variables for 4 situations using the binomial test indicates a statistically significant difference between the study distributions from the binomial. The significance level of all distribution, except for the manipulation strategy in the 4th situation, the significant level is 0.385. As for the second situation, the frequency of choosing strategy of cooperation and compromise is higher. And when analyzing the experiment, we could see that in the second situation, the respondents chose the idea of compromise in 32.8 cases and cooperation 25.5 cases. As for the third situation, in symmetrical business negotiations, where we have a weakened, more dependent sales position, the frequency choosing a strategy of compromise and cooperation was higher. Cooperation 29.8% and compromise 29.4%. And the last situation in symmetrical business negotiation, where the negotiator has a stronger and less dependent position, we could see that the most popular strategy was the strategy of ignoring, 26.5%. It's worth noting that in all the other cases, this strategy was the least popular, 6.7, 9.7, 5.5, for example. The fifth hypothesis, the frequency of choosing a manipulation strategy to a lesser extent than the frequency of other strategies depends on the specifics of the situation. You can see the table where you can see how in the first, second and fourth situations you can see the frequency of ignoring, domineering, cooperation, compromise and manipulation. And we took the difference between the maximal frequency and the minimal frequency in a given situation. This is the last line. When ignoring, the difference is 50, and in terms of percentage 21, with domineering 46, in terms of percentage 90.3, cooperation 41, percentage 70.2, compromise 45, percentage 18.19, and only with manipulation you can see that the difference between the highest and lowest frequencies is only 12. In terms of percentage is 5.1. That is 3 times less. This is why we can conclude that manipulation is evenly distributed across the situations. Thus, we used the distribution of 5 variables for 4 situations using binomial test indicates a statistically significant difference. Then the next 3 hypotheses. Men are more likely than women to plan the manipulation strategy. When choosing strategy or manipulation, tactical methods of influencing will be often chosen such as masking the fact of the influence, maximizing your true goal, impact of the self-esteem of another person. And argumentation persuasion will be used less frequently. When choosing the strategy of domineering, such tactical methods of influence will be more chosen more often, such as pressure and compulsion. And the use of words must and emphasizing possible gains and benefits will be used less often. The factor analysis of 27 tactical methods of influence in Group A was conducted, then with Group B, and then for the merged Group A and B. And 3 factors were identified. These are the factors that you can see in the table. That is domineering, that is coercion and pressure and compulsion. Second is manipulation, target concealment, impact masking, impact on self-esteem. And the third factor is emotional strategy. Emotional appeal strategy initially was outside the scope of a thesis, so I did not interpret it anymore. I just suppose that possibly it is a distinct strategy, or it is at the same time the use of the strategy of cooperation and compromise. The results of the factor analysis are supported by confirmatory analysis. As for the sixth hypothesis, so let's use the regression method and let's compare men and women according to these criteria. You can see that based on the factor of manipulation, the average figure for men is higher than for women. And the average error is rather low. And the standard deviation shows that this criteria is correctly applied. I also used the criteria for independent samplings and the factor of manipulations. The average range is 469 and the P criteria is 0.0005. Thus we can conclude that men use the strategy of manipulation more often than women. And as to hypothesis 7 and 8, about the strategy of manipulating, we conducted the factor analysis of group B, and in here you can see 3 factors identified, which have pressure, compulsion, which forms domineering. The second factor is emotional appeal that I'm not analyzing, and the third is manipulation, that is masking the goals, masking the pressure, disguising the pressure, and the change of roles. I also conducted the factor analysis of the merged sampling, where I got the groups A and B on 27 tactical methods. And 2 factors are domineering and manipulation. One more type of analysis that was used to look at the strategy of manipulation and domineering is the check of the frequencies. Different participants took different strategies during the negotiations, and after the negotiations, the participants were told to find 4 or 5 strategies of influence. Thus, the choice of tactical methods is determined by the strategy of negotiations, as was the case. Since when providing the instruction to the participants, we told them that they need to find 4 or 5 tactical ways of influencing, taking into account the strategy chosen. And the influence of strategy on the choice of tactics is the difference between the frequency on all the negotiations and the figures of a certain strategy used. As for the strategy of manipulation, in here you can see the general for group A, which methods were preferred when people were using manipulation, consciously using manipulation, and the difference in frequencies. The profile of manipulation looks different. The disguise of the factor of pressure increases, and the influence on self-esteem as well. And the table here shows the general information that was received. The first are different statistical methods, then factor analysis, and the difference of frequencies. In the first line, we can see the tactical methods. What you can see, the masking of the factor of influence and the masking or disguise of the goal. In 4 cases, relation as to the object was found in 2 cases, but that was significant in 2 cases because the fact analysis is more reliable. And the same strategy of the comparison of the difference in frequencies was used for the domineering strategies. You can see the general profile for all negotiations and the profile for domineering strategy. The difference is the increase in pressure, the increase in using such words as must, increase in forcing. Also, I have a table, this table on manipulation, where in the first group you can see the statistical methods used. In the first lines you can see the methods identified with the use of these methods. Pressure in 4 cases, coercion in 4, decrease in the use 3, and decrease in the pronunciation of goals in 3. But that was important because we were talking about the fact analysis of the 2 samplings. Thus, the conducted research described in the thesis proved the above-mentioned provisions for defense. Thank you for your attention. Nikolay Yuryevichев, thank you very much for your speech. And now we move on to the next point of our procedure. Are there any questions to the applicant according to the presentation? Nikolay Yuryevichев, thank you very much for a very interesting report and presentation. My question is the following. How could you explain the result that you achieved in your thesis, that the less frequent use of tactical strategies are metaphor, analogy, and the influence of the self-esteem of the negotiator? Thank you very much for the question. I have a slide dedicated to this issue, and my answer will be the following. I conducted the analysis well, in here you can see the table, the choice of tactical methods for all the negotiations, for Group A and for Group B. And Group B was presuming the tactical methods, and Group A had to guess the tactical methods. It's interesting to say that when I looked at the profiles, they were very similar, and I conducted a correlation analysis between the profiles of Group A and B. The correlation analysis is as following. 0.705 TB candela. This is significant correlation coefficient. But on the other hand, I conducted a different type of analysis. I looked how many strategies were actually guessed. These are 68.5%. That means 61% were not guessed. That led me to the idea that the participants of Group B very often thought that they guessed the strategy, but very often they put the methods that they found more understandable. I assume in mass perception, there is a certain rating of the methods of influence that people might look at when choosing. And this rating might have a historical and cultural basis, so it depends on this certain epoch and culture. And thus, such rating exists. We have the most chosen types of tactical strategies, and these are the less frequently chosen strategies, such as metaphor analogies, quotations, sayings, and I believe that these methods are less frequently used, not because they are inefficient, but people understand them less and they do not know how to implement them. According to my 20-year experience of business trainings, I teach the participants of my business trainings, and these methods require more explanation. And when people understand them, they understand how efficient they are. Are you satisfied with the answer? Yes, thank you very much. Quite. Are there any more questions? I address the members of the Dissertation Council. Are there any more questions? Yes, Svetlana Nikolaevna, please, you're welcome. Nikolay Yuryevichef. We can see that now you're ready to answer to the remarks of the reviewers, but I would like to ask a question which is related to the remark that I have sent to you, but nevertheless it more focuses on the report. In your research, you use personal questionnaires, but I might presume that possibly because of the results that you have received, you didn't create a provision for defense based on these personal questionnaires. But what surprised me was the lack of hypothesis linked to the personal characteristics. The question, why did you use personal questionnaires? And why, even in your presentation, you didn't mention any information about the questionnaires? So there were no assumptions related to the questionnaires, and there are no hypotheses related to the use of the questionnaires. Thank you, Svetlana Nikolaevna, for the question. My answer will be the following. Of course, initially I had hypotheses related to the link between the personal characteristics and the use of certain given strategies or tactical methods of influence, and the link between the personal characteristics and the results of the negotiations. But I conducted different types of analysis: correlation analysis, T-criteria analysis, and the data that I received, according to my perception, were not significant enough to put them into my presentation. That's why I didn't include this information. In my thesis, you can find this information concerning what I was doing and how I conducted my research and what I was aiming to get. But as for the significance of the results achieved, they are of minor significance. That's why I didn't mention them. Nikolay Yuryevichef, I understand your answer pretty well, but I would like to say that I disagree with that, because a negative result is also a result. And if you could formulate such an assumption and then said that this assumption turned out to be of no significance, that would have been better. And me, as a professor, a professional dealing with the psychology of personal characteristics, would be a very important thing. And it would have only improved your presentation. Yes, I agree with you, and I agree with the remark. Thank you. Dear colleagues, are there any more questions? I have a question. You talked about the symmetrical and asymmetrical negotiations. What criteria is the basis of using this term? based on the position or about their psychological preparation? Thank you very much for the question. The criteria is the position, because in the first situation, people were talking about sharing business, and when negotiating they were in equal situations. Then we were talking about personal negotiations, when people were talking about which film to choose. These are friends. And the situations 3 and 4, these are positions from the point of view that we have a manager, sales manager, and his role is asymmetric in a more dependent position, since the sales manager offers and the purchase manager might reject or agree. And in the fourth situation, when the purchase manager is an actor, we have an asymmetric situation, since there is a position of dependence. You have more choice and you might use other options. So from the position, so social position, social role was much more important than the level of psychological preparation of the participants. The level of psychological preparation was not identified during the thesis. I understand that it could have been done, but I didn't do that. One more question. In your presentation, you said that men use this strategy of manipulation on the stage of planning more often. Then there is a gap between planning and using. Well, planning is one thing and using is another thing. How do you bridge this gap? Well, that's true. If I used such methods of having supervisors, for example, a text analysis, it would be possible to identify whether these strategies were implemented or not. But I didn't have the means to conduct any more of such research, to analyze texts and to get supervisors. Well, in the future, I'm planning to use this strategy. Alexei has had a similar question, and I answered that in my future studies, I'm thinking about that. And nowadays, the opportunity to decipher the speech allows it to make it cheaper. If there are no questions, let's move to the second part of our procedure.
If I may.
Yes, you can ask your question.
Hi, Nikolay. Thank you for your presentation. The interpreter was very fast, but fortunately I had already read the dissertation, so it was easy to follow in the end. So you probably made the life of the interpreter quite difficult. He was great.
I know. Sorry.
So building on the questions of the colleagues as well, a small comment on the individual differences. I suppose you know there was a debate from 1975 and after whether personality plays a role in negotiations, and there was too much emphasis placed on the structure of negotiation interest rather than personality. So it would be useful to discuss in the presentation as well what you found on personality variables. And you know I had a remark on that as well, but you probably discuss that later on. So also on the question on whether there's a difference between planning and implementing as well, and about asymmetry, I have a general question about the validity of the studies. So I don't know what method you used in creating these scenarios, whether you think they're representative of what goes on in real life negotiations, what you might leave out from these scenarios. For example, in terms of asymmetry, if you're talking about asymmetry in power, you could have a manipulation check asking how powerful do you think you are in this negotiation? And see whether participants feel more powerful in one negotiation or the other negotiation scenario. So how representative do you think these scenarios are? And how valid do you think your results are? So a general question on how you created these scenarios and how representative you think they are. Thank you.
Это очень сложный вопрос на самом деле.
Well, it is a very difficult question, I would like to say. Thank you very much for the question. Well, definitely that there are certain limitations to the research, and the limitation that I created myself when I was planning these 4 situations. And there are certain limitations related to the number of points and to the sharing of points, for example. Because in the first situation, the participants had to agree who would get 49% and who would get 51% of the shares. And if they agreed to get 50%, then everybody got 0 points. So I used more competitiveness, and I understand those limitations. But on the other hand, despite these limitations, the results are valid and reliable, since there were representatives, real representatives of commercial organizations. These were people who conducted negotiations knowing what negotiation means. And these results can be considered valid, since the people, the participants, didn't know that they were a part of an experiment. This game, the strategy of negotiation tactics, was either conducted as a part of a business training or a separate game, and people had the motivation to win. They were interested to get to know this topic and to have a look at these strategies and to implement them. And because of that, there were fewer of invalid results. And as a result, and as a whole, the results might be considered reliable and valid. But I do accept that there were certain limitations, and I put the participants into strict situations. But I provided the maximal inclusion of participants in the game this way. Otherwise, there would be no inclusion, and there would be true implementation of what they really wanted to do. And then I want to say that map is not equal to territory. Any model cannot describe reality, but model tries to describe the reality as well as possible. If I'm not mistaken, the first part was which method did you use when creating the design of your research? Yes, Alexis, am I right? So the first part of the question?
Yes.
Because you provided
yes,
the answer to the second part of the question only.
You focused a lot on the validity depending on the background and the participants you used, but one part concerns how you constructed these scenarios and what makes you think that they're representative of real-life scenarios.
Well, the method I used to create these scenarios, so to say, my expert knowledge about how negotiations take place and what are the key aspects, what are the main challenges during commercial negotiations. So how can you call this method? You can call it as the method of analysis and the research of real activity and modeling of this activity in the business game. So, are you satisfied with my answer?
Don't necessarily agree with this method, but yes, I'm satisfied with the answer. Thank you.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, are there any more questions? Then we move on to the next part of the procedure. The reviews of the participants of the Dissertation Council. The option is as following. After the reviews of all the members of the Dissertation Council, Nikolay Yuryevichев provides the answers to all the remarks. Do you object to such a form of procedure? No objections, thank you. I would also like to say that there were no out-of-university reviews of the thesis. We move on to the reviews by the members of the Dissertation Council. So all the reviews were published on the website of St. Petersburg State University. What I offer is to voice only the key issues, remarks and questions to the applicant. Are there any objections? No, thank you. The first review will be voiced by Natalia Evgenievna Vodopyanovna. Can you see and hear me? Dear colleagues, members of the Dissertation Council, dear Nikolay Yuryevichев, I would like to say that the work had a very good influence on me. The topic is relevant, and analyzing the strategies and the ways of manipulation during commercial negotiations is highly relevant. Nevertheless, manipulations are very often used and often considered the main instrument. The operational part of the negotiation strategy was conducted in a rather reasonable manner. Yes, personal questionnaires were used, and well, I didn't understand why we pay attention to the gender roles, and are there any other personal characteristics that might influence the choice of manipulation strategy. I would like this work to continue in the future. But any defense, if it creates more questions, if it results in more questions, then the thesis is really good. I would say that the methods used are positive, but we should take into account the influence of the personal characteristics. The propositions for defense, which I'm not going to list, I agree with. I have no questions related to that. The dissertation has conclusion, and the level of quality is rather high. Then I'd like to voice a few of my remarks. And the first of my remark is, wouldn't it be better during the game to allow participants to choose the strategy of behavior, to choose any out of 5 strategies, not the one which is left? Maybe in such a case, the quasi-experiment would reflect the real negotiation situation, in which definitely you don't have the choice of the strategy based on the strategies left. Then it could be possible to research the link between the choice of strategy and the personal characteristics of the participants of the experiment. The second remark: why during the quasi-experiment the groups A and B, each series of them was asymmetrical? In my opinion, it would be more productive from the point of view of the received data in each series of the quasi-experiment to get the situation where the representatives of both groups A and B first planned the usage of a certain strategy and used these tactics during negotiations, and then made assumptions which strategies and tactics were used by the opposite group. And the third, the quasi-experiment before the negotiations, the participants of Group A were offered a short description of the strategy of negotiations, but they didn't get the description of 27 tactical methods of influence. The participants chose the methods based only on the name of the method. Maybe it would be better to give a concise description of the tactical methods. So I'd like the applicant to provide information based on these points. And the fourth remark is the following. The usage of the strategies and tactics of negotiations was considered according to the factor of conscious choice of this or that tactics or strategy, or in terms of perception. On the whole, the thesis of Rysev, Nikolay, Yuryevichef on the topic psychological features of these strategies of the influence in behavior in commercial negotiations corresponds to all the requirements and the regulations, and I consider that Rysev, Nikolay, Yuryevichef deserves being awarded the candidate of psychology, major 190003. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much, Natalia Evgenyevna. Now I give the floor to Professor Svetlana Nikolaevna Kostromina. Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, I would like to begin my reviews from stating the fact that Nikolay Yuryevichef was in a rather difficult situation. Well, he himself, in the beginning of the work, talked about the plethora of studies which are dedicated to negotiation mediation. There are many such negotiation which is linked to interdisciplinary stages of negotiations. But despite such number of studies on the topic, Nikolay Yuryevichef managed to identify the topic of the thesis, the topic of the research, among the existing studies. It is of crucial importance that he put negotiation strategies together with different types of negotiations, specified the idea of effectiveness, specifying limitations based on the content of the negotiations, of the personal characteristics of negotiations, and the positions of them. And the idea of correlation of certain types of negotiations because of the personality trait makes the relevance and novelty of the research. As for the novelty, the author himself provides different strategies. The 5 strategies are provided in detailed. And this detailed approach to the theoretical part allows us to have a look at the efficiency of each of the strategy and the general efficiency of all the strategies, depending on the tactics used in a particular strategy. In my opinion, the novelty as such, in my perception, is first of all the use of non-traditional theoretical approach. Apart from general negotiating strategies, there are necessary and additional components depending on the types of the context. And this context-based approach is very well described in the theoretical part. Why do I say that it's not traditional? Because in many cases, in many theses, negotiations are studied depending on the situation. The context approach is used less frequently. In here we have more context approach in the theoretical part. It describes how negotiations are being conducted, taking into account political, historical, marketing, and life contexts. But on the other hand, on the level of empirical part, although this context approach is not provided in such detail in practice, but the attempt of its implementation can be seen through business negotiation or through personal negotiation. So we can see two types of contexts, although there could be more. But the idea itself and its implementation opens the perspectives for other researchers, depending on the context. And the fact that it was analyzed in a non-traditional method is of special importance. And this is a positive aspect of the thesis, and it can be later expanded. We can take into account the cultural perception and so on, the historical background. And the psychological understanding of the processes taking place stresses the personal influence of negotiators. The value for science and practice. I would like to name two aspects. Have a look at the practical and theoretical aspects. On the theoretical level, we can see two criteria. That provided the author's classification of the strategy. What is the negotiator oriented at, the subject or the object, which is a very important theoretical factor which should be noted. And the idea provided, these two criteria, they correlate with other concepts and expand them because of this ecological context. But I would like to make a short remark, or rather commentary. The author states that the list of the systems describing the strategy of negotiations lifts the limitations of previously created models. Well, in my opinion, it has a little bit different. If take into account two criteria used for the classification, if it was graphically represented, it would be easier to grasp. The model would have looked nicer. But maybe that's the type of my perception, and it did not decrease the theoretical value of the work anyway. I would also like to say that the theoretical analysis is rather comprehensive, because it talks about the strong and the weak points of the studies. And the niche or the gaps that need to be worked on. As for practical value, I would like to say only a few words about it, because we can see that a business game was introduced. Different tactics and strategies are provided in detailed. And these strategies and tactics can be used to educate the personnel and to forecast the efficiency of negotiations. As for the validity of the results, I must agree with the colleagues. As for the method used for the description of the situations, well, if the author relied not only on his expert vision, but used expertise, outside expertise, this work would have only benefited from it. Nevertheless, we can see the analysis of the models of behaviors during the negotiation process that is represented based on the scientific works. The understanding of the problematic, we see the methods of the quasi-experiment, and we can see a large number of participants. But of course, of high importance is the number of situations analyzed, and about 1,000. It gives us a large number of data which could be mathematically analyzed. The quasi-experimental model what is important, the participants didn't have the information that they participated in the experiment, which minimized any external influences on the results. So the validity of the results, and we can see that thus the objective analysis of the data was provided. I'm not going to talk about the structure of the work. Taking into account all the positive aspects of the dissertation, I have a few remarks. As any interesting work, it has certain remarks. Well, first of all, the text of the thesis uses the phrase business negotiations, and the game for the quasi-experiment is called the business game. But nevertheless, in the name of the thesis, we talk about commercial negotiations. So what is the context researched, business or commercial? Secondly, the formulations of the novelty, points 1 to 3, are doubtful. The novelty is specified according to special rules. But if we take into account the limitations of quasi-experiment based on the number of participants and the range of the tactics, the freedom of choice, and there was no freedom of choice, isn't it excessive to say that domineering and ignoring is more pertaining to purchase managers? Maybe such generalizations are not quite clear. The manipulation strategy is not of the best choice. This phrase is not clear because the content is not clear. The position for defense is only a generalized description, so it's not clear what exactly is the provision for defense. The frequency of the use of strategies That's the first provision, page 15, which is a very generalized assumption, and it looks more like a maxima than a verified meaning. Well, obviously, if a person is participating in the negotiation process, he or she takes into account the interests of the other party. Third, the author uses such a criteria as the success of negotiations, but neither from the methodological part nor from the empirical part, it is not clear how this successfulness could be estimated, how the points of the success were allocated. But on page 123, we see the efficiency of the negotiations. So what are we talking about? The success of negotiations or the efficiency of negotiations? Did you use both, or do you mean them in synonyms? And the fourth point, I can voice it once again because I've mentioned it again. The author verifies the validity of the questionnaires, but only for Group A, the author conducts the comparison of personal characteristics and the success. And for the Big Five, correlation analysis is performed. For emotional intelligence and max scale, comparative analysis is used. And the logic of using such statistical references is not explained. And why there was no analysis of the Group B conducted. And what are the results if it was conducted? How can the author explain such humble results related to the link of the personal traits and the success of the negotiations based on each criteria? And why there was no correlation between correlation analysis conducted between the personal characteristics and the negotiation tactics. Finally, I would like to say my remarks refer to some of the contents of the dissertation, but I would like to get the answers to these questions. Now I'd like to say that the dissertation on the major 190003 psychological features of the strategies of the influencing behavior in communication negotiations complies with all the requirements as submitted with State University, and the applicant Rysev Nikolay Yuryevichef deserves to be awarded the scientific degree of a candidate of psychology. Thank you very much for your remark. Now I would like to give the floor to Alexis Arvanitis. Are you ready?
Thank you. Yes. I read the English translation that Nikolay did with his dissertation. That's a lot of work, so thank you for doing that work for us. It was great to read your dissertation. There are many things to like about that dissertation, like the effort to make a new theoretical framework for negotiations. The fact that you placed special emphasis on manipulation, that was very important. Trying to find the relationship between strategies and tactics, that was also very useful and important. Now finding differences of strategy, like ignoring, you might find some differences between the scenarios, but not with regard to manipulation. That was interesting as well, although that's an avenue for future research. Which type of situations would evoke one type of strategy compared to another? Also, it was important to have some personality variables embedded in your research. So there are many different things that you did with your research that made it innovative. And I know you spend a lot of effort into trying to make it an integrative framework for negotiation. So all in all, I was very glad that I had the honor of reading your work. Now, you know that no PhD is perfect. So there will always be, or no research is perfect. So at some point you have to say that this is my work. I did the best I could with this research, and I'm going to improve on that later on in my career. So I did make some comments, and you also replied to them. So I'll go briefly through those comments. Some of these comments have to do mainly with what I said before about the scenarios and how representative are of real-life negotiations. And you've read these comments and responded to them very kindly. So a few points on the scenarios. The scenarios do not really offer win-win potential. Both parties would end up splitting a pie of 10 points in all scenarios, and there was no possibility of increasing the size of the pie. And that makes it quite competitive. And from most definitions that we use and operationalizations that we have within negotiation, we usually offer participants the chance to increase the size of the pie. So under some circumstances, they could split a pie of 20 points or 25 or 30 points. And that's what win-win negotiating is about. And although you do mention in your responses that, of course, people can cooperate in a distributive situation, and distributive negotiation as well, it's not the same if they're able to expand the size of the pie. So that's one limitation. Another limitation is that you imposed a competitive situation at some points where you said that if one party could only have 51% and the other party could have 49%, but no 50% was possible in one situation. I think maybe two, I'm not sure. So that made it even more competitive in a way. Of course, on the one hand, they were competitive. On the other hand, you have results showing that the participants did choose cooperation and compromise in many cases. So that's a possible answer. Of course, again, on you're measuring mostly intent and perception, did not allow for actual measure of what they actually did during negotiation, what the participants actually did during negotiation. And you said that it's one of the things that is a limitation, and it is a strong limitation. With regard to the analysis, you did present in your thesis some results showing that mostly successful parties had a stronger scoring on the max scale or the interpersonal understanding scale. I did mention that in my comments. You did reply that you didn't have significant results with correlation, and you did not do regression. I have to say that this is something that is frowned upon in psychology. If you don't have significant results in your main analysis, you don't try to do median splits and find other ways to have significant findings. That's what we call p-hacking, that you're trying to find a significant result where there is none. And I suppose that's why you excluded these analyses from your presentation in a way. So I would downplay these results. I would report that there were no significant findings, and in more exploratory analysis, then I found this. But these results should be treated with caution. Now, okay, so one final comment was that there was no limitation section in which you could write about these things. As I said, there's no research without limitation, without problems, without avenues for future research, and this should be laid out more convincingly at the end. And maybe you can address some of these issues by adding such a section. But all in all, and in conclusion, I think that your work is original and it adds to the literature. And so my conclusion is that Nikolay Yuryevichев deserves the award of the scientific degree of the candidate of science in psychology in the specialty 190003. Thank you.
Спасибо большое за ваше выступление.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And now I would like to give the floor to Abosnova Alexandrovna. First of all, I would like to agree with the previous estimates of the colleagues and talk about the relevance of the research. I don't want to repeat what my colleagues have mentioned. As for the novelty, the most interesting, in my perceptions, are the results based on the frequency of choice of the 5 strategies of negotiators and the frequencies for every situation. The aspect of scientific novelty was also mentioned, linked to the correlation of the strategy and the situation, and correlation between the strategies and tactics used. And I had a remark concerning this issue. On the whole, it creates scientific novelty, which you cannot deny. I highly appraise the results achieved, and I would like to proceed with my remarks. There are 3 remarks. First, why in the final part of the thesis there is operational content only for the strategy of domineering and manipulation without detailed description of strategies of ignoring, compromise and cooperation. Second remark, the thesis doesn't provide the explanation of the low number of links between the questionnaires and the choice of strategies and tactics on the other hand. Well, this question has already been addressed. In my perception, the non-existence of such correlation, of such a link, is not novel. Well, I might agree that this is the case, but I would like to have the description and to at least the mentioning of that. And thirdly, the research work uses commercial negotiations and business negotiation as synonyms. Can we consider commercial negotiations a case of business negotiations? The above mentioned remarks do not decrease the positive impact of the dissertation. And I would like to say that the thesis on the topic psychological features of the strategies of the influencing behavior in commercial negotiations complies the requirements established by St. Petersburg State University, and the applicant deserves being awarded the scientific degree of the candidate of science in psychological, scientific major 190003. Thank you very much. And now I would like to provide my remarks on the thesis, Psychological Features of the Strategies of the Influencing Behavior in Commercial Negotiations. It is well known that scientific community and commercial community is interested in the influence of negotiations. And we have seen a lot of studies dedicated to the topic. I would like to say a few words about the content of the research. And I would like to say that this work is a breakthrough in studying commercial negotiations. This is the development of an interesting author-based frame of negotiations. It has a very interesting operational strategy matrix. This is a very comprehensive analysis of different factors and variables that need to be taken into account when considering the success and the efficiency of the negotiation. And the instruments used by the author can be considered unique. With great respect, I would like to treat your work and your thesis, because I am aware with the books that you've published, and I used some of those books when I was preparing different business games myself. During our today's meeting, I would like to say that there were many interesting insights, and in future you could pay attention to them. You mentioned if manipulation is not perceived by the participants, the efficiency of negotiations is much higher when they understand that there is somebody domineering over them, and this is manipulation. This is a very controversial issue and very interesting issue, and it could make a separate research. The question is, what is more efficient? When you understand what is going on right now with you and which manipulative technique is being used, or when you post factum understand what has happened when nothing can be changed. I would also like to pay attention to the fact that in your future work, and I hope that you will continue researching, so I'd like you to pay attention to the idea of symmetry and asymmetry, and the social status is not always of key importance. I thought about the results that you have achieved, that purchase managers are more aggressive than sales managers, despite the fact that according to US books, we can see that sales managers are more aggressive. These are very interesting facts. I would like to say that in future, possibly, there should be put different stresses on the level of preparation and of planning of methods and instruments used and the real life situations of their use. But despite a lot of interesting content and different emphasis that could be researched in the future, I have a number of questions and remarks. I respect my colleagues very much, and most of them have already mentioned the remarks that I'm planning to voice. My first remark was the usage of the personal questionnaire Big Five, and how and why the profiles of personalities did not correlate and were not compared to the strategies chosen. But Svetlana Nikolaevna has already mentioned this aspect. My second question, which sampling shows that there was such lack of correlation? Why is there such a difference about the domineering and the aggression level between the sales managers and purchase manager if we compare foreign literature? My third remark is related to the fact that there is a non-standard approach used by you. You have certain goals. You have a very tricky formulation of the object. What is the object as such? Is it the strategy or the situation or the methods? As of the non-standard layout of the thesis paper. The thing is, who are your people? You are interested only in the situation, in the strategy, but who are the people, who are the participants, how are they prepared, how frequently do they participate in negotiations? These are the issues of key importance that wasn't seen and could be only found in the middle of the work. Nevertheless, the above mentioned remarks do not make the impact of the thesis negative. And considering the requirements established by the Order of St. Peter's State University, Rysev Nikolay deserves the award of scientific degree of Candidate of Science and Psychology in the Scientific Speciality 1903, work Psychology Engineering and Psychology Economics, for this thesis of psychological features of the strategies of the influencing behavior in commercial negotiations. Points 9 and 11 of the above mentioned order haven't been violated. Dear colleagues, dear members of the Dissertation Council, I would like to give the floor to the applicant to reply to the remarks. Thank you very much. Well, I have prepared many replies to the remarks. Well, first, about your remarks about the Big Five and the questionnaires and the strategies. And this is related to Svetlana Nikolaevna's question as well. As I have mentioned, when we were planning this research, we hoped that there would be more similarities between the questionnaires and the tactics. Only few links were found. One was the correlation, a negative correlation between expressiveness and practicality with the demands. This is a very low correlation, 0.157. There was an attempt to find the link between the negative choice. The strategies could be chosen based on the ones that are left. So for each situation, only the strategy that was left could be chosen. That's why it was impossible to conduct the correlation analysis. So it could be conducted only based on the negative choice, which strategy was not chosen. And this correlation analysis did not give any significant results. Secondly, about the purchase managers and sales managers and their domineering strategy. And what sampling shows that, if we know that according to foreign literature, foreign works, the situation is quite the opposite. As for the sampling, well, I have already mentioned that and I'm not going to repeat it again, but I do agree that I didn't put this information on the participants in the introduction so as to make it clearer. How can we explain the high level of aggression of the sales managers? We considered business-to-business negotiations, B2B negotiations, and the more interested party is the sales manager because they have a weaker position. And if they use aggressive technologies and strategies more often, it results in the fact that they get a negative reply from the purchase managers. So if they use the strategies of compromise and cooperation, they can achieve their targets. If we talk about the purchase manager, his position is stronger and less dependent. They prove to choose the strategy of domineering, because thanks to such strategy, they can not choose the offers that they don't find beneficial. Some purchase managers are even told to use methods of domineering and ignoring consciously, so it's often used consciously. And from the point of view of aggressive sales, we don't have it very often in B2B medium. And many companies use the win-win approach rather. So this is why the respective managers are more prone to use these strategies of domineering or compromise. Then about the goals of the research. Traditionally, there has to be one goal. Well, there might be the perception that the thesis has several goals. I do agree with that, and I agree with your remark, but the goal of this thesis is studying 5 strategies of negotiations, but in their interconnectivity with their connection with the tactical methods of influence and in their connection with different types of situations. Thus, the object is strategies, and additional object are situations and methods. I have already mentioned the sampling. I should have introduced the information about the participants in the beginning, in the introduction. And there is no information about the years of work and the social status. And it is explained by the fact that the participants didn't know that they were participating in an experiment. That's why in their handout there were only a few questions, well, in my opinion, an adequate number of questions. And if I asked them about these additional characteristics, such as the frequency of having negotiations, the years of negotiation practice, well, that would have caused many questions and even maybe resistance from the participants. And it would have complicated the conducting of the game, because people would feel that they are under control. This is why I used the characteristics that I have mentioned. Well, I've answered your remarks, I suppose. Now I move on to Svetlana Nikolaevna Kostromina. As for business negotiations, well, Alexander Alexandrovich had the same remark, and commercial negotiations. Yes, I could have mentioned or written that commercial negotiations is a case of business negotiations. To say that commercial negotiations are mostly dedicated to buying and purchasing and the distribution of actives between the parties. And this research is dedicated to commercial negotiations. As for the business game, well, there is a term, business game. It can be used in the context because it is a well-known term which means a technology of education. As for the novelty, the way we use the too much generalizations, well, the information that I received was based on the frequency of the choice of strategies. Maybe I should have formulated it a bit differently. So I don't think that the idea that the domineering and ignoring is more attributed to the sales managers rather than purchase managers. So I think that my research proves my generalization. Also, there was a remark about overgeneralization, about finding the key moments of psychological manipulation. Well, I would like to say that the word identifying could be substituted for a different word. Well, yes, I did not identify anything. But if we talk about validity of the data received, well, validity is provided by the fact analysis, by the frequency difference analysis. I think it is based on the method conducted with the limitations given. Svetlana Nikolaevna said that the frequency of the use of the strategy of negotiations is linked to the measure of taking into account the interests of the other party, is a too generalized approach. That was the beginning of the sentence, and then I specified it. Maybe I should have specified it in the very beginning, but still it reflects the general idea, because we analyze the frequency of use and the measure of taking into account the interests of the other party. Well, I should have specified it. As for the success of negotiations, success and efficiency. As for the success and efficiency, I should have used one term because I used them as synonyms. As for the way they were calculated, when I was making my thesis, I put the description of the business game into the second part, and it became too big. So I put it into the first appendix. And in the first appendix, you can see how the points were allocated. For the first negotiations, the points were given to the party that got 51%, that which got 49%, they got no points, and so on and so forth. A similar situation was for the second negotiations. As for the third negotiations, there was a division that Group A, if you sell the tables per $100, you get 10 points. If you sold them for $99.91, you get 7.5 points, and so on and so forth. I didn't give this information in the text of the thesis itself, but I put it into the appendices. So how was it estimated? It was estimated according to the points allocated. As for the questionnaires, this is the answer to the fourth remark, which is related to the remarks by Alexander Alexandrovich Obaznov.
Да, значит, давайте по поводу.
Yes, first of all, I conducted correlation analysis, which did not yield any results. Then I conducted the analysis of criteria. And I conducted it for all the three tests, and the Big Five, and the max scale, and emotional intelligence. But only two yielded results. That's max scale and emotional intelligence. In particular, interpersonal understanding. Well, I didn't specify it in the thesis, yes, that was my mistake. I conducted correlation analysis afterwards. I conducted the correlation analysis between the characteristics received and the personal characteristics of 5-factor analysis. But this data was not included into the results because they are not highly valid, I would like to say, but I would like to get better data. In here is the correlation between the max scale and the factor of independence. That's not a high correlation, minus 0.311. There is no explanation why the analysis for Group B wasn't conducted. Well, I'm explaining why. So at first we were planning to conduct it for Group B. But in the structure of the business game, the Group B got additional points for guessing the strategy and tactics. And although the leaflets had points where places where they had to put these points, many participants ignored this requirement and often mixed all the points. So in general, it could be easy to see the overall point that they counted, and this overall point could not be used for statistical analysis because it depended not only on the efficiency of the negotiators, but it depended on the fact how much they guessed or non-guessed the strategy. Well, the humble results of the link between the personal characteristics and the success of the negotiations. The success of negotiations is determined not by personal characteristics, but by skills of negotiations. That's my first hypothesis. The success of negotiations is determined by the knowledge of how to use the technology of selling and negotiations. And next, during the process of choice in commercial companies that are linked to negotiations on sales and purchases, people with different specific personality traits get involved. Why there was no correlation between personal traits and the result? There was one link conducted. It showed that people with higher result used such and such tactics, disguising of the influence, praise and pressure. These are the 3 factors used depending on the efficiency. The results are valid, but not as valid, so as to be proud of that. This is why I didn't include it into the provisions for defense. As for Alexius Arvanites, well, I'm answering to the first remark. Well, Alexius justly mentions that the dissertation did not conduct the analysis of the 5 strategies listed in the 10 strategy classification. Well, I would like to say that I used 5 strategies as the most important ones, and I wanted to put the remaining 5 strategies as the issue to research for the future. And that's why I included 10 strategies for the scientific community to have a look at it and to hear the point of view of the scientific community. But maybe I should have concentrated on these 5 strategies and not listing all 10 of them. The second remark. About the negotiations, about cooperation. There was only 50-50 split. So there were no cases where you could get more than 10 points. In here, I would like to say that according to the rules, in all 4 situations, the participants from Group A and B got only 10 points. They didn't have the option to get more. Thus, they didn't get the direct structured win-win approach. In my next research, I will plan such an option of point allocation. This is a very important remark. On the other hand, it doesn't mean that the participants could not use the win-win approach, because the participants of Group A consciously chose a strategy of cooperation. In all the 4 situations, they could describe their activity so that everybody could win more, thus expanding the world picture of the opponent. That means that they in future could get more than those 10. Of course, they didn't get points for that, but when they spoke about the results to me, they used the strategy of cooperation, despite the fact that they didn't use any additional points for it. The next comment about the strategy of ignoring, that the strategy of the business game decreased the possibility of the use of the ignoring strategy. On one hand, it is definitely like that. But on the other hand, ignoring as a strategy had such a definition. You don't take into account the ideas of your opponent, and you follow your own line. You focus on other circumstances. You start speaking about other topics or answer the certain questions by keeping silent. So these were the advice provided to the participants. Thus, ignoring is interpreted rather broadly. So we can ignore certain topics, that is. Well, I do agree that in the 4th situation where the Group A used more strategy of ignoring than in other groups, the participants thought that they have more opportunities outside the negotiations. It can be explained by the fact that purchase managers also compare sales managers with other distributors, so they think outside the framework of negotiations. But the negotiations were formed in such a way that despite people were using the strategy of domineering or ignoring, still they had to find consensus. Because if they did not find consensus, they would all get 0 points. So they were stimulated thus to be not outside the negotiations, but within the negotiation process. I would like to agree that the situation in the both cases of negotiations could not allow for 50-50 split, and this was done on purpose to create the competitive environment. In my opinion, the members from Group A could use the strategy of ignoring to get there, to achieve their goal. As for the other methods of estimation as outside advisors or text analysis, well, I have already mentioned that. Yes, I thought about that, but I decided not to use those methods simply because of the lack of means. Well, in the future, and I'm planning to continue this research, I will definitely use the analysis of negotiations and of the speech analysis, because these means are more and more available. And a similar question was asked by Natalia Evgeniyevna, so I have already answered this question. The final remark: the relationship between the performance and individual differences of variables. Well, the correlation between the efficiency and individual differences variable raises a couple of questions. You are right, Alexius, in a way. Well, I don't remember the term you said in English. Well, I do agree with you. that we need to conduct a progressive analysis. As for more time should have been dedicated to the idea of what is the interpersonal character of the intellect. I would like to say that interpersonal understanding allows the negotiator to plan the right moves during the negotiations. Inner personal understanding is maybe more important for personal negotiations, not for business negotiations. It helps you to limit your aggression and stress level. And these skills are important, but they are reactive skills. So we react to something in such a way. And interpersonal skills are active skills. This is why they are more important. And inter-skilled operation is also a very important skill. I can say that because the scenario of the game had a higher level of interpersonal approach, because during the game the participants could learn something during the game itself. The participant then became equal in this skill. That's my assumption, at least. Well, as for limitations, well, I do agree that there should have been a separate chapter for limitations. As for a Bosnov remark about the operational content for the strategy of domineering manipulation without the detailed description of the strategy of ignoring compromise and cooperation. A factor analysis was of key significance for me. And the second factor was the frequency difference. And when the factor analysis was correlating with that, then it was an important achievement. Only for domineering manipulation, the factor analysis showed the operational content of these strategies. And for ignoring compromise and cooperation, we got it only through the difference in frequency method. And I considered it not enough to be put for defense. So I described it in the dissertation, but I didn't put it for defense. As for the questionnaires and the choice of strategies, well, I have answered this remark partly. Why there are so few links? Well, I have already described that probably people, when they chose the tactics based not on their personal qualities, but based on a cultural, historical vocabulary that exists. And some are more preferable, others are less preferable.
И следующее, синонимы понятия.
As for the synonyms, business and commercial negotiations, I have already mentioned that. Business negotiation is a more general term, and I should have specified it. As for Vodopyanova, could people choose a strategy themselves? I considered this option, but I was afraid that in such a case, people would choose only the strategies compromise and cooperation, since they're more socially positive. So I won't be able to choose manipulation and domineering technique. So this is why I decided that the participants can choose only the strategies that were left. I would like to conduct a research where people would be able to choose freely. Why there was asymmetry in each series of the games. I wanted to create a symmetric situation, but the test of this game showed that this made the game very difficult for participants. They mixed their roles, it took a lot of time, and they got really tired. So we decided to make group A and B asymmetric. The course experiment described 5 strategies, but there was no description of 25 technical methods. I thought about writing the description of the tactics used, but on the other hand, it would have made the business game much more sophisticated and lengthy. And intuitively, people understand what is meant from the name. And the participants didn't have any questions related to the fact, well, what is it? Since I decided that they are intuitively clear, I understood that I was right, because the participants didn't have any problems understanding what method is meant by its name. And the fourth remark, the usage of strategies and tactics. I have already provided answer to that. When I was talking about the Alexis Avranitis remark. That's all. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for taking so much time. Thank you very much. We continue the work. Natalia Evgenievna, you are here. Are you satisfied with the answers to your remarks? Can't hear you. Natalia Evgenievna, we can't hear you. We can see you, but we can't hear you. Can you hear me now? Yes. Yes, thank you very much. I'm satisfied with the answers. Dear Svetlana Nikolaevna, are you satisfied with the answers to your questions and remarks? Yes, thank you. Dear Alexander Alexandrovich, are you satisfied with the replies? Yes, thank you. And dear Alexis Avranitis, are you satisfied with the answers?
I'm satisfied, thank you. The term, Nikolay, is p-hacking. P from p-value, p-hacking.
Yes, p-hacking. Thank you. Thank you
Yes.
very much.
From those present in the audience, does anybody want to speak? There's nobody willing. The scientific advisor will be given the floor. Did we get any questions via email? No. Then we move to the next point, and we give the floor to the scientific advisor, Sergei Alexeyevich. I don't want to take much of your time. Everybody's starting to understand. Nikolay Yuryevichef provide detailed answer to all the remarks. The main thing with cooperating with Nikolay Yuryevichef was that we don't often have the correlation between theory and practice. And what I liked about Nikolay Yuryevichef, that based on his experience, he theoretically explained the practical methods that he used as a business trainer. I hope that we will have such an approach of psychological practice in the future. I hope that other practicing specialists will come to our department to theoretically ground their practical approach. Thank you. Thank you very much for your speech. Colleagues, from the members of the Dissertation Council, from those people present, would anybody like to take the floor? I have a question. Have we received any questions via email? No, we haven't. then the discussion is over then. Before summarizing the final vote, I'd like to ask the members of the Decision Council and the applicants. Do the members of the Decision Council and the applicant have any comment or question about the procedure, including those relating to remote access mode? I would like you all to answer. No?
I actually would like to know
Yeah, because
the votes. What is the concern? What are the options we have? Yes or no?
No.
Acceptance of.
Yes or no, yes.
this is not about the voting yet. This is about whether you have any questions at this point. We will move into the voting procedure a little bit later.
Okay, because you said about the procedure.
Yes, procedure, but not the voting procedure.
Okay, sure.
So you have no questions to the procedure. Alexis, do you have any questions to the procedure?
No question.
Then we'll move on to the next point of the procedure. My question is to the members of the Decision Council. Before we vote, we can make a break, if necessary, to discuss the results of the defense and mute. How do you think? Is it necessary to make this break to discuss the results of the defense? No, we don't need a break. Yes, I agree, we don't need a break. If there is no need to discuss the results of the defense, then we continue at the meeting and we proceed to voting. I ask the curator of the defense to provide me with the turnout list of the members of the Decision Council present at the meeting. As for the voting, you can only say yes or no. If you agree that the applicant is to be awarded the scientific degree, or if you disagree. Dear colleagues, we continue the work and we move into the key part of our Dissertation Council meeting. Please check if we can hear and see each other well. Yes, everything's all right. So I'm raising the question of awarding Nikolay Yuryevichef Rysev with the degree of Candidate of Psychological Sciences in the Scientific Major 1900-03, Work Psychology, Engineering Psychology, Ergonomics, for an open roll call. I remind you that the decision of the Decision Council on the issue of awarding an academic degree is considered positive if more than half, but at least 3 members of the Dissertation Council who participated in the meeting voted for it, according to the clause 23 of the procedure. Member of the Council, Fortepianova Natalia Evgenievna, your opinion. I'm for awarding. Council Member Professor Kostromina Svetlana Nikolaevna, your opinion, please. I'm for awarding. Council Member Professor Bosnov Alexander Alexandrovich, your opinion, please. I vote for. Council Member Alexios Arvanitis, your opinion, please.
I am for awarding as well.
Okay, you agree. Спасибо.
And I, the Chairman of the Council, Guryeva Svetlana Kotovna, I vote for the research paper. Thus, dear colleagues and guests, I declare that out of 5 members of the Council participating in the voting of the Decision Council, voted for 5 people, voted against no, abstained no. The decision to award to Rysev Nikolay Yuryevichef, the scientific degree of the candidate of psychological sciences on the scientific major 1900-03 works of psychology, engineering, psychology, economics. Accepted. Nikolay Yuryevichef, you're given the floor for the final word. My route towards it took 5 years. I'm very grateful for all the members of the Decision Council, for all your questions, for your remarks, for your commentary, because when I was answering these commentaries and your remarks, it made me think about the future a lot, and the questions were very deep and thorough. Thank you very much for it. Firstly, I'd like to thank my scientific advisor, Sergei Yuryevichев, for his support and for the mental guidance that he gave me, for all the times when he showed me that I was wrong. That was extremely important to make this thesis real. That was a great honor and privilege to work with you. And I'd like to thank all the participants of the Decision Council for agreeing to be part of the Decision Council. It was a great honor and privilege to speak in front of you with my humble thesis. Thank you very much, Svetlana Dakotovna, for chairing this meeting. Well, I would like to express the general opinion of the members of the Decision Council. We'd like to congratulate you. The meeting is declared closed. Thank you all for the participation. Please turn off the live broadcast of the meeting.